So it's day 256, and as I'm looking through the news, I'm struck by the fact that there's really nothing good happening. I mean, there's nothing. If on either side, there's really not a lot of good coming about. It's bad for the Ukrainians, and it's the Russians are bogged down. I mean, I don't know how they get out of the mess that they've created, and I just I don't want to sound nihilistic or melancholy or whatever, but it's just bad. So let's look at the headlines, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So I'm starting here, and I'm looking at the British military. The Defense Department from Britain puts out daily updates, and this is today's daily update. The Colonel General Alexander Lapin, who is purportedly removed from office at the end of October 2022, follows a series of dismissals by senior Russian military commanders since the onset of the invasion. Now let's stop there. You don't replace commanders unless something has gone wrong, right? I mean, you don't, like, whoever's in charge, and if the thing's working, you let it work. But they've replaced commander after commander. They've also lost commander after commander being killed by missile strikes or whatever. I mean, like a dozen of them or something along those lines. Lapin has been widely criticized for poor performance on the battlefield in Ukraine by both Chechen leader Kadyrov and Wagner head Prigozhin. Okay, and so he's been criticized. He's not really done a great job on the battlefield. He's dismissed. But who do you have to replace him? They don't really have anybody of any great value. But when we get down to number 4, these dismissals represent a pattern of blame against senior Russian military commanders for failures to achieve Russian objectives on the battlefield. What the Russians have done is spread misery. They haven't really achieved the battlefield successes that they were looking for, which is good. I don't want them to. I want Ukraine to prevail. But here's the thing that was the most miserable line of the whole thing. This is in part an attempt to insulate and deflect blame from Russian senior leadership at home. Now, I've noticed a trend as I watch this, and I've read a lot. Okay, so as I look at it, whenever something goes wrong, Putin is never to blame. Putin always is the person that's protected, like insulated from blame of the generals or the people mobilizing or the people that rolled out this thing or that thing wrong. But, you know, Putin, he's awesome, but everybody below him in senior leadership is always to blame for everything that goes wrong. And there's something corrupt in the system that allows him to still stay above and over it, as if Putin's not the instrument that's actually causing the thing to get started in the first place. So he's not to blame, but he is the force generating the madness of it all. So it's very frustrating to watch. Now, this was really interesting in the ISW. This was yesterday, November 5th. I scrolled down, I was reading, yeah. And then I got to this. Former Donetsk People's Republic Security Minister and current DNR military commander Alexander Khodorkovsky claimed on November 5th that the Russian friendly fire may have caused up to 60% of total Russian losses since the end of the Russian offensive operations in Mariupol. So, more than 1 out of every 2 Russians killed was friendly fire, they're saying? Now, that could be in 2 different ways. So there's friendly fire that's accidental, and then there's, if you're retreating, we kill you, because there's actually a front line behind the front line. And the Soviets did this as well during World War II. But they're starting to do this now, and you can go look this up. I'm not making this up, where there's a secondary front line behind the front line that if you retreat or surrender, you'll be shot by your own side. Now, the ISW also goes on and says, even if the statistic is exaggerated, which I don't think 60%, I mean, if that's the case, that's nuts. But I can't imagine that it's really that high. That's probably just something hyperbolic. But even if this statistic is exaggerated, the fact that a Russian commander is publicly speculating on such damning indicator of Russian proxy competency indicates deep challenges that the Russians face. The Russians are really in a hole, and that they have allowed that messaging to get so out of hand is really incredible to my mind. Okay, the Russians are evacuating from Kherson or from the northwest bank of Kherson, or they say they're evacuating. We don't know. Maybe it's a trap. Maybe they're actually evacuating. We're not sure. But what we do know, and I showed you this yesterday about the looting and pillaging of museums and taking ambulances and cars and everything else that they could possibly take that was of any value. So remember, the narrative was supposed to be that they're chasing out these Nazis who are oppressing their fellow Russians who happen to go by the name Ukrainian. But they're really just pillaging along the way. I mean, it's not like they're defending anyone there as much as they are just wantonly taking, brazenly destroying things. This is the Kherson Regional State Administration building that the Russians had, and they abandoned recently after they were going through and pretty much stripping it of anything of value, destroying anything that they felt like destroying along the way. The flag came down the other day. This is just another picture of the building here, and they just, Jesus said, by your fruits you'll know them. By their fruits you'll know them. And when you see just the wake of destruction that follows the Russian invasion, it makes you wonder, like, maybe what they were saying about coming in to liberate wasn't really what they were doing. Now, I didn't believe that to begin with, but yeah, I don't see that. It's really bad. So, okay, let's keep moving. Not just what the Russians were doing on the ground, but what the Russians were doing by, sending missiles. This is really, and Zelensky called it the right thing, energy terrorism. It is terrorism. It's not terrorism to strike at the Sevastopol port, the military ships, which the Russians call terrorism. That's not terrorism. That's legitimate in the time of war. Striking at civilian buildings, civilian infrastructure, a shopping mall, the power generation statements that's going to deprive civilians of water and electricity, that's terrorism. The Kyiv mayor says he can't rule out the capital being left without water and power. And what will the downside be of this? Well, if you have a mass exodus from Kyiv, where are these people going to go? And who's going to be affected most? It's not going to be military-aged men who can handle it most. It's going to be the elderly and the youngest that are going to struggle the most, right? Particularly the elderly. They're doing this essentially a blitz on these utility stations and things, and it made me think of the Blitz, like what the Nazis were trying to do in World War II, trying to bomb London into oblivion to make the people buckle under. And air power is very powerful, I get it, but it's not enough, and it's not going to make the people fold. This is the Blitz in World War II, and what things look like on the ground. And I mean, I don't know how you get a bus in here like that. Wow, that's some blast, right? But it didn't make the British fold, and it's not going to make the Ukrainians fold. It's only going to make them, it's only going to stiffen their spine and cause them to resist even more. So I don't know that this strategy, what the Russians are doing to Ukraine, is going to have the effect that Putin thinks it has. It's just going to make people miserable along the way. So the Washington Post was reporting that the U.S. officials were trying to, here, I'll read it. The United States is privately encouraging Ukraine to signal an openness to negotiate with Russia, said the Washington Post. The newspaper cited unnamed sources as saying that the request by American officials was not aimed at pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table, but a calculated attempt to ensure that Kyiv maintains the support of other nations. And you can read the actual report in the Washington Post. And so that's what's going on there. Now, we'll have a little fun with Russian state media now, and we'll look at what RT had to say. So here's the same thing. U.S. privately urging Ukraine to negotiate, says WAPO, Washington Post. And then they were honest about pressure is intended to alleviate foreign backers' concerns about a long conflict, sources say. But then they frame it a little bit differently. The White House is privately asking top Ukrainian officials to show openness to peace talks with Russia. And then they give some commentary. Kyiv's public refusal to negotiate with Moscow, unless President Vladimir Putin is removed from power in Russia, must be abandoned. The encouragement isn't aimed at pushing Ukraine to engage in actual peace talks with Moscow, and so they're reiterating that. Ukraine fatigue is a real thing for some of our partners, an unnamed U.S. official told the Washington Post. Now, that probably is true. And Putin knows this. Putin knows that General Winter is coming, and that's going to be an ally in his side. And he knows that if he can splinter the coalition backing Ukraine, that he has a chance. But without that, I don't think that Russia can prevail. But the article then gets down to the bottom where it says Russia, which has repeatedly invited Ukraine in recent months, Ukraine authorities to come to the negotiating table in recent months, has blamed Kyiv for undermining any potential for a peaceful settlement of the crisis. So you don't think annexing land that was their land would have, at any rate? How can we discuss any possible agreements when there's no willingness to even talk to us from the other side? Putin said. But of course, they always say any negotiating is going to be determined by your willingness to understand that these four territories are now Russia. And then you add to it other fuel to the fire. So, for example, here's another article in RT, Dead Hands Revenge. What would happen if the West strikes Russia? They're constantly talking about nuclear strikes precipitated by the West. The West doesn't want that. The West isn't saber-rattling about nuclear strikes. And I look at a lot of news reports, and that's not what's going on. But here's an RT, and they're talking about this, and they constantly talk about it. We could strike back, and we reserve the right to strike if we need to, and there could be dirty bombs, and blah, blah, blah. And they go on and on about this. And then even a couple days ago, Dmitry... Dmitry Medvedev was just talking about, like, if Ukraine wins, that means that they're taking back that territory. And then that evokes Article 19, which allows us to use nuclear weapons to defend our territory. So they keep just pounding on this theme of nuclear weapons. Within hours, millions would be dead. Hundreds of millions more would die in the following days. Gray ashes would soar into the air and scatter upon the ruins of what used to be Moscow. The U.S. would have blown up all the decision-making centers in Russia, but what about Washington? The very same thing. Not only with the American capital, but other NATO cities would be destroyed as well. And they go on and they talk about history in the Soviet Union and ally themselves with the former Soviet past that is no more, that they tend to think that they're just this big bad thing, and they're really not. Okay, so you have nuclear weapons. I get that. But the nuclear weapon thing is kind of like being a musclehead. It doesn't really help you. What I mean by that is this. I've been into martial arts for years, and so I've spent a lot of time training in. I went from mix of Taekwondo and Goju-Ryu to Taekwondo to Aikido to combat Hapkido to Judo and Jiu-Jitsu. So I've been around for a long time, and I've noticed that there's a difference between someone who is actually able to fight and somebody who is just huge and muscular. Most martial artists don't actually look like the big musclehead guy, right? The guys that are trying to, like, enjoy what they look like in the mirror when they, oh, I'm tough, right? They don't look like that. And those guys are really, they're strong, but they're stocky. They can't actually employ that strength necessarily. Like, if there was a fight, they wouldn't necessarily move with the kind of speed or agility that they would need. That's kind of what it's like to have nuclear weapons. Russia, if you looked at Russia and you just said, if you just took away the nuclear weapon picture of Russia, you wouldn't think a whole lot about it, right? But because they're a nuclear power, we think about them differently, but they can't actually use the nuclear weapons. See, that's the thing. Just like the United States is a very strong power, but couldn't use the nuclear weapons in Iraq or Afghanistan. So really, nuclear weapons are off the table, but they keep using this as saber rattling because the threat is worse than the actual use. The threat is sometimes more powerful, and I'm not saying that nuclear weapons are nothing. They're nothing to turn your nose at. I understand that, but the threat of it is actually keeping the West from doing a lot of things that the West otherwise might do. So they spend a lot of time on this nuclear saber rattling because I think they know that they can't actually use it, but they can keep threatening. And who's to say that they're just not crazy? So I think that's what's going on here. Why they keep talking about nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons. But when I look at all this, I look at article after article, everything I talked about today. So let's just recap for fun. Okay, so here we have generals turnover and generals being killed. We have friendly fire incidents killing such a high percentage. We have the destruction in Kherson. We have the destruction of the city population centers where they're going to have to probably have a mass exodus if they can't rebuild quickly. We know that the Blitz kind of approach is not going to work. We know that Washington is pressuring Ukraine to at least have some semblance of negotiate to hold the coalition together, but the negotiating isn't going to be real. We know that. We know that they're not going to actually have legit negotiation. And so everything that we've talked about has just been almost depressing. I don't know how to say it any better than that. It's all bad. But it's really, I want to end it on this particular note because I saw this and I thought, wow, this is really the cost. And we're looking at this and we're just taking in the news, trying to understand what's going on, but there's a real cost. See those flags? Every one of those flags is a loss of a Ukrainian. That's what this is. That's what this memorial is. And it's every one of those flags is the loss of a Ukrainian. And look at that. Just the destruction. And for what? Like, what was the gain? Where did this come from? I mean, it was on a pretext that we're going to invade to liberate. And why did we liberate them from what? And what was successful and how many did you lose? I saw a report where they were talking about, tens of Russians have been lost. Tens of Russians, they were talking about tens of thousands of Russians have been lost. I'm thinking like, no, you're into the 100,000 plus mark between at least between killed and wounded. And I don't know what the ratios are, but it's tragic everywhere you look. And it's not just bad, it's worse, whatever is going on. I'm sorry that I don't have better news for you today. I'm sorry that I can't show you some stunning victory, but this is just the ugly reality of where it is. Thank you for spending your time listening to me talk about this today, and I hope I have better news for you tomorrow. Thank you for caring about Ukraine.